I'll never forget the moment I realized my mother-in-law had been poisoning my husband's mind against me for 3 years. But what she didn't know was that I had discovered her secret, a secret so devastating, so utterly destructive, that when I finally revealed it to the entire family at our anniversary dinner, her perfectly constructed world collapsed in less than 5 minutes. My name is Sarah Matthews, and this is the true story of how I went from being the beloved daughter-in-law to public enemy number one, and how I orchestrated the most satisfying revenge that left my mother-in-law begging for my forgiveness. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share will shock you to your core. Before I continue, if you appreciate real stories about justice, family drama, and people finally getting what they deserve, hit that subscribe button right now. I share true revenge stories weekly that will leave you speechless. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this story. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 5 years ago, I met Daniel Matthews at a charity gala in Manhattan. I was 28, working as a senior marketing executive at a prestigious firm, and he was 31, a successful architect with his own practice. The moment our eyes met across that crowded ballroom, I felt something I'd never experienced before, an instant connection that seemed to transcend logic and reason. Daniel was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: intelligent, kind, funny, ambitious, and devastatingly handsome, with those deep brown eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything: architecture, art, our childhoods, our dreams, our fears. By the end of that night, I knew my life had changed forever. We dated for 18 months before Daniel proposed. It was perfect. A sunset proposal on the Brooklyn Bridge, the city lights twinkling behind us as he got down on one knee with a stunning vintage ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down my face as he slipped that ring onto my finger. But there was one significant complication in our otherwise perfect love story: Eleanor Matthews, Daniel's mother. My first meeting with Eleanor should have been a warning sign, but I was too blinded by love to see the red flags waving frantically in front of my face. Daniel had arranged for us to meet at her Upper East Side brownstone, a stunning 4-story building that screamed old money and establishment prestige. Eleanor Matthews was 62 years old, impeccably dressed in a cream Chanel suit, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon. She was beautiful in that cold, untouchable way that some wealthy women cultivate, like a porcelain doll that might shatter if you touched it. Her blue eyes were ice chips as they assessed me from head to toe when I walked through her door. "Sarah," she said, extending one perfectly manicured hand without warmth. "How interesting to finally meet you." The way she said interesting made it clear she meant something entirely different, but I smiled, determined to make a good impression on my future mother-in-law. The lunch was excruciating. Eleanor asked pointed questions about my family background. My father was a high school teacher, my mother a nurse, and I could see the disappointment flickering across her face with each answer. She inquired about my education, state university, not Ivy League, and her lips pressed into a thin line. When Daniel mentioned that we were planning to buy a modest apartment in Brooklyn, she actually laughed. "Brooklyn?" she said, as if he'd suggested moving to a third-world country. "Daniel, surely you're joking. The Matthews family has lived in Manhattan for 4 generations." "Times change, Mom," Daniel said gently, squeezing my hand under the table. "Brooklyn is vibrant, artistic, perfect for us." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Perfect for her, you mean?" That comment hung in the air like poison gas. Daniel immediately jumped to my defense, but the damage was done. I had seen the truth in Eleanor's eyes. I wasn't good enough for her son. I didn't come from the right family, attend the right schools, or move in the right social circles. To Eleanor Matthews, I was an interloper trying to steal her precious son. But I loved Daniel more than I feared her mother's disapproval, so I pushed forward, determined to prove myself worthy. Our wedding was a year later, a beautiful ceremony at the Plaza Hotel that Eleanor had insisted on planning and paying for. I had wanted something smaller, more intimate, but Daniel convinced me to let her mother have this. "It'll make her happy," he said, "and maybe once we're married, she'll warm up to you." I should have known better. The wedding day itself was gorgeous. 200 guests, flowers everywhere, a live orchestra, everything money could buy. But there were small, subtle things that bothered me. Eleanor had accidentally given the florist the wrong color palette for my bridal bouquet. She had changed the menu without telling me, removing the one dish I'd specifically requested, my grandmother's recipe that held special meaning for me. When I gently confronted her about these changes, she smiled that cold smile and said, "Oh, darling, I thought you'd trust my superior experience in these matters. After all, I've been planning society events for 40 years. Surely you don't think your limited experience qualifies you to make these decisions." Each word was a tiny cut, delivered with such practiced sweetness that anyone overhearing would think she was being helpful. But I heard the truth beneath. "You're not good enough. You never will be." Still, I smiled through it all, because at the end of that day, I married Daniel, and I thought that was all that mattered. How naive I was. The first year of our marriage was a careful dance between happiness with Daniel and increasing tension with Eleanor. We bought our Brooklyn brownstone, a beautiful historic building that needed work but had incredible character. Daniel and I spent weekends renovating it together, laughing as we painted walls and refinished floors. Those were some of the happiest days of my life. But Eleanor hated that house. She visited exactly once, spent 15 minutes walking through with an expression of barely concealed disgust, and never returned. "I don't understand why you insist on living in this neighborhood," she said, as if Brooklyn were a slum instead of one of the most desirable areas in New York. "We love our home, Mom," Daniel said firmly, but I noticed he looked uncomfortable, caught between his wife and his mother. That discomfort was exactly what Eleanor was counting on. The manipulation started small. Eleanor would call Daniel multiple times a day, always when she knew I was at work. She'd invite him to lunches, dinners, museum exhibitions, always with the caveat that it was just the two of us, darling, like old times. She'd buy him expensive gifts, custom suits, designer watches, first edition books he'd mentioned wanting, and then make pointed comments about how she hoped I wasn't taking advantage of his success. "I know you're doing well, darling," she told him once in my hearing, "but you must be careful. Women from certain backgrounds sometimes see successful men as opportunities. I'm just protecting you, as any mother would." I was standing right there when she said it. Daniel immediately defended me, but the seed was planted, and Eleanor was an expert gardener when it came to cultivating doubt. The really insidious part was how she positioned herself as the victim. Whenever Daniel and I tried to set boundaries, like asking her not to call during our dinner time or requesting she check before visiting, she'd become tearful and dramatic. "I've lost my son. That woman has turned you against me. I'm your mother, Daniel. I gave birth to you, raised you, sacrificed everything for you, and now I'm being cast aside like garbage." It was masterful manipulation, because Daniel, who was a good, kind man, couldn't stand to see his mother cry. He'd feel guilty, apologize, and slowly the boundaries we'd set would erode. But it got worse. Much worse. Eleanor began making comments about my appearance, always couched as concern. "Sarah, dear, you're looking a bit tired. Perhaps you should try that spa I go to. They work miracles with problem skin." Or, "I hope you're not letting yourself go now that you've married. Men do notice these things, you know. Daniel's father left his first wife when she gained weight." This was a complete fabrication. Daniel's father had died when Daniel was young, and there had then no first wife. But she said it so matter-of-factly that it planted doubt in my mind. Was I gaining weight? Was Daniel noticing? Was I becoming less attractive to him? She commented on my career. "Still working those long hours? I do hope you're not neglecting Daniel. A marriage requires attention, you know. Men stray when their wives are too focused on their careers." She criticized my housekeeping. Oh, you haven't dusted in here? I suppose career women don't have time for such things. Daniel was raised in an immaculate home, but I'm sure he'll adjust to lower standards. She questioned my intelligence. I don't think you understood what I meant, dear. Let me explain it more simply for you. Every comment was designed to make me feel inadequate, and the worst part was that she only said these things when Daniel wasn't around to hear them. When he was present, she was the picture of sweetness, always complimenting me, telling him how lucky he was, playing the role of supportive mother-in-law. I tried to tell Daniel about her behavior, but my complaints sounded petty when I voiced them out loud. Your mother said I looked tired, or she implied I'm not a good housekeeper. These seemed like small things, easily dismissed, and Eleanor was clever enough to never leave evidence. No texts, no emails, just those poisonous words spoken in private moments. You're being oversensitive, Daniel would say gently. Mom can be a bit old-fashioned in her views, but she means well. She's from a different generation. Just ignore it. But you can't ignore poison when it's slowly killing you. The real turning point came about 18 months into our marriage. I had been promoted to VP of Marketing at my firm, a huge achievement that I was incredibly proud of. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, more responsibility, and recognition in the industry. I was thrilled. When I told Daniel, he was genuinely happy for me. We went out to celebrate, talked about what this meant for our future, made plans for the renovations we could now afford on the house. It was a perfect evening. Until Daniel mentioned it to his mother. Eleanor's reaction was swift and vicious. She called me directly, something she rarely did, and her voice was dripping with false sweetness. Sarah, darling, I heard about your promotion. Congratulations, of course, but I do hope you've thought about the implications for your marriage. Implications? I asked, confused. Well, you'll be earning more than Daniel now, won't you? Men have such fragile egos about these things, and you'll be working even longer hours, I imagine. When exactly will you have time for a family? You are planning to give me grandchildren, aren't you? Or is your career more important than my son's happiness? Every question was a dagger expertly thrown, and the worst part was that she'd voiced concerns I'd already been worrying about privately. I did wonder if Daniel would feel emasculated by my success. I did worry about work-life balance. I did want children eventually. We haven't discussed timing yet, I stammered. Of course you haven't. You're too busy climbing the corporate ladder. Sarah, let me give you some advice, woman to woman. Men like Daniel, successful, attractive men from good families, have options, many options. If you're not careful, if you don't prioritize his needs, he'll find someone who will. And then where will you be? A divorced career woman approaching 40, biological clock ticking, all alone. She said all of this in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor, sharing wisdom, helping me. But her words cut deep because they played on my deepest fears. After that conversation, I became paranoid. I started watching Daniel more closely, looking for signs that he was unhappy, that he resented my success, that he was looking elsewhere. My confidence, both in myself and in our marriage, began to crack. And Eleanor noticed. Predators always notice when their prey is wounded. She ramped up her campaign. She began posting photos on social media of Daniel from his childhood, tagging them with captions like, "My perfect son before he was taken from me," and "missing the days when Daniel was truly happy." She'd show up at Daniel's office with lunch, making sure his colleagues saw how devoted and loving she was. She volunteered to help with Daniel's business expenses, positioning herself as his supporter while subtly implying I wasn't pulling my weight. One night, about 2 years into our marriage, I overheard Daniel on the phone with Eleanor. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I'd come home early from work and he didn't hear me come in. "Mom, I've told you, Sarah and I are fine. No, she's not distant. She's just busy with work. I know you're concerned, but... Mom, please don't cry. Of course I love you.
Yes, I know you only want what's best for me. The conversation went on for 40 minutes. When he finally hung up and found me standing in the doorway, he looked exhausted. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." "Daniel, what did she say about me?" He sighed, running his hair through his head. "She's worried about us. She thinks you're pulling away, that you're more invested in your career than in our marriage. She mentioned that she's noticed you seem unhappy lately." "I am unhappy, but not because of my career, because your mother is constantly undermining me, criticizing me, making me feel like I'm not good enough for you." "Sarah, that's not fair. She's my mother. She loves me and wants me to be happy. And she thinks I'm making you unhappy?" Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Eleanor's poison was working. "I didn't say that," he said finally. "But maybe we should think about what she's saying, about balance, about priorities, about starting a family." "Are you seriously taking her side right now?" "I'm not taking sides. Why does everything have to be a battle between you two? Can't we all just get along?" That night, for the first time in our marriage, Daniel slept in the guest room, and as I lay alone in our bed, I realized with horrible clarity that Eleanor was winning. She was slowly, methodically destroying my marriage, and I was powerless to stop it. Or so I thought. Everything changed 3 months later when I met Margaret Chen at a networking event. Margaret was an elegant woman in her early 70s, a retired journalist who now volunteered with various historical preservation societies in Manhattan. We struck up a conversation about architecture. She was interested in historic brownstones, and I mentioned the work Daniel and I were doing on our place in Brooklyn. "Your husband is an architect?" she asked with interest. "What's his name?" "Daniel Matthews." Her reaction was strange, a flicker of recognition followed by what looked like concern. "Matthews? Eleanor Matthews' son?" "You know Eleanor?" Margaret's expression became carefully neutral. "I knew her a long time ago. We moved in similar social circles. How is she?" Something in Margaret's tone made me curious. "She's, well, very involved in Daniel's life, perhaps too involved." Margaret studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, "May I give you some advice, my dear? Be very careful with Eleanor Matthews. She's not the woman she pretends to be." My heart started racing. "What do you mean?" Margaret glanced around the crowded room, then pulled me aside. "I probably shouldn't say anything. It was all so long ago. But Eleanor had another son before Daniel. His name was Christopher." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "What? Daniel never mentioned a brother."
He wouldn't have. Christopher died when he was 7 years old. Tragic accident, or so Eleanor claimed. Christopher was playing in the family's upstate house, fell down the stairs, broke his neck. Eleanor was the only one home at the time. Oh my God, that's horrible. Yes, horrible. But here's the thing. Christopher's father, Eleanor's first husband Thomas, never believed it was an accident. He tried to investigate, insisted something wasn't right about the story. Eleanor had been suffocating that boy, you see, helicoptering over him constantly, never letting him have any independence. Thomas had finally put his foot down, told Eleanor she needed to back off, let Christopher breathe. They had a huge fight about it the day before Christopher died. Thomas was at work when it happened. My blood ran cold. Are you saying Eleanor killed her own son? I'm saying nothing was ever proven, but Thomas believed it until the day he died. He divorced Eleanor afterward, left her everything in the settlement just to get away from her. Married Daniel's mother, a lovely woman named Patricia, a year later. Daniel was born, and then Patricia died of cancer when Daniel was 5. And somehow, Thomas and Eleanor reconciled. She moved back in to help with Daniel, and she's been there ever since. Thomas died when Daniel was 8. Heart attack. Very sudden. Eleanor was there when it happened too. I felt sick. Why isn't this common knowledge? Money and power, my dear. Eleanor's family was one of the oldest in New York society. They buried the rumors, threatened legal action against anyone who repeated them. Thomas signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of the divorce, and after he died, there was no one left to question Eleanor's version of events, except me. I was Thomas's cousin. I know what he believed. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a photo, a young boy with Daniel's eyes, smiling at the camera. Christopher Matthews, the brother Daniel never knew about. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because I see the way you're trembling when you talk about your mother-in-law, because I've seen Eleanor destroy people before, and because I don't want to read about another tragic accident in the Matthews family. Be careful, Sarah. Eleanor doesn't let go of her sons." After that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about Christopher. I started researching obsessively, digging through old newspaper archives, death records, anything I could find. The story Margaret told checked out. Christopher Matthews, age 7, died from a fall downstairs in 1985. Eleanor had been the only witness, and Thomas Matthews had indeed divorced her shortly after, though the details were sealed. I found Thomas's obituary from 1993. It mentioned that he was survived by his son Daniel and his ex-wife Eleanor, who had moved back in to help care for Daniel after his mother's death. How convenient for Eleanor. But the real bombshell came when I hired a private investigator, something I never thought I'd do, but I was desperate for answers. I gave him everything I knew about Eleanor's history and asked him to dig deeper. What he found was absolutely chilling. Eleanor Matthews had a pattern. Her first husband, Christopher's father, Thomas, had died of a sudden heart attack at age 42, young for a heart attack, especially for a man that was described by his friends as athletic and healthy. Patricia, Daniel's mother, had died of aggressive cancer at 38, fast-moving, diagnosed late despite regular checkups. And there were others in Eleanor's orbit who had met untimely ends or suffered mysterious health crises. The investigator couldn't prove anything criminal, Eleanor was too smart for that, but the pattern was undeniable. People who got in Eleanor's way, who tried to separate her from her sons, who challenged her control, those people often ended up dead, sick, or destroyed. And I realized with absolute certainty I was next on her list. But Eleanor had made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated me. Because while she'd been busy poisoning my marriage with her subtle manipulations and psychological warfare, I'd been documenting everything. I had recordings of her vicious phone calls. I'd started recording them after she denied saying cruel things to me. I had screenshots of her manipulative text messages to Daniel. I had statements from friends who'd witnessed her behavior. And now, thanks to Margaret and my investigator, I had the truth about her past. Eleanor Matthews wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law, she was a monster who had possibly murdered her own son, definitely destroyed her first husband, and spent decades perfecting the art of psychological abuse and control. And I was going to take her down. Planning revenge against someone like Eleanor required precision, patience, and perfect timing. I couldn't just confront her with accusations. She'd deny everything, play the victim, and turn Daniel even more completely against me. No, I needed to expose her in a way that would make denial impossible and force everyone to see the truth. I spent the next 3 months meticulously planning. First, I reconnected with Margaret Chen and asked if she'd be willing to testify to what Thomas Matthews had told her about Christopher's death. She agreed immediately. She said, "I've wanted to speak truth about Eleanor for 40 years, but no one would listen. Thomas made me promise not to while he was alive, and after he died, I had no proof. But if you're finally bringing this woman's evil into the light, I'm with you." Next, I reached out to others who had known Eleanor over the years. My investigator had provided me with names, friends of Thomas's, colleagues of Patricia's, even some of Eleanor's own former friends who had been discarded when they questioned her behavior. One by one, I contacted them, explained what I was trying to do, and asked if they'd share their experiences. The stories I heard were horrifying. A former friend of Eleanor's named Diane told me about how Eleanor systematically destroyed her marriage when her husband became close friends with Thomas. She spread rumors that my husband was having an affair, Diane told me, tears in her eyes, even decades later. She fabricated evidence, sent anonymous letters. My marriage imploded, and only years later did I find out Eleanor was behind it. She couldn't stand that Thomas had a close male friend who might influence him against her. A colleague of Patricia's, Daniel's mother, told me that Patricia had confided shortly before her death that she was afraid of Eleanor. Patricia said Eleanor was always watching her with Daniel, always making comments about her parenting, always undermining her. Patricia told me she was considering asking Thomas to cut Eleanor out of their lives completely. She died 3 weeks later. Each story was another piece of evidence showing Eleanor's pattern of destruction, and I documented it all. But I needed more. I needed something that would be undeniable to Daniel specifically, something that would break through years of maternal programming and force him to see his mother clearly. That's when I remembered the letters. When we'd moved into our brownstone, Daniel had brought several boxes of his childhood belongings that were stored in Eleanor's attic. Most of it was normal stuff, old report cards, photographs, trophies, but there was one box we'd never fully gone through. It was labeled Daniel's father's things in Eleanor's precise handwriting. I went home one afternoon when Daniel was at work and opened that box. Inside were Thomas Matthews' personal effects, his watch, some cufflinks, a few books, and at the bottom, wrapped in plastic, was a journal. Thomas Matthews' journal. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The entries spanned several years, from shortly after Christopher's death through Thomas's remarriage to Patricia, and they were devastating.
Thomas wrote about his suspicions regarding Christopher's death, about how Eleanor's story had changed slightly several times, about how Christopher had been terrified of his mother in the weeks before his death, telling Thomas that Mommy gets angry when I don't do things perfect, about how Eleanor had been giving Christopher strange vitamin supplements that made him dizzy and confused. I believe Eleanor murdered my son, Thomas wrote in one entry dated August 1986. But I have no proof, and the police have closed the case. My lawyers advise me that pursuing this will only drag Christopher's memory through the mud and traumatize Daniel. So I'm taking the coward's way out, divorcing Eleanor, paying her off, and trying to build a new life with Patricia and Daniel. But I will never forgive her, and I will never stop believing that she killed Christopher because she couldn't control him the way she wanted. He was starting to assert independence, starting to challenge her, and she couldn't tolerate that. God help me, I left Daniel with her when Patricia died. I pray every day that I haven't condemned my second son to the same fate. The entries after Patricia's death were even more chilling. Thomas wrote about how Eleanor had convinced him to let her move back in, how she'd used his grief and his fear about being a single father to worm her way back into their lives. He wrote about his regrets, his fears for Daniel, his suspicions that Eleanor had somehow caused Patricia's cancer to progress so rapidly. The final entry was dated 2 days before Thomas's death. I'm going to tell her to leave. I've finally found the courage. I'm going to tell Eleanor she needs to move out, that Daniel and I will be fine on our own, that her presence is unhealthy for my son. I've documented everything, this journal, the evidence about Christopher, my concerns about Patricia. I'm going to confront her tomorrow. If anything happens to me, this journal is proof that Eleanor Matthews is a dangerous woman who has destroyed everyone who got in her way. Thomas died the next day, of a sudden heart attack. Eleanor claimed he'd simply collapsed while they were arguing about household matters. The journal had been packed away in the attic, never seen by anyone. Until now. I sat on our living room floor, sobbing as I read Thomas's words. This man had known the truth about Eleanor. He had tried to protect his son, and she had killed him for it. I was sure of it. Now I had everything I needed: testimony from witnesses, evidence of Eleanor's pattern of destruction, and most damning of all, Thomas Matthews's own written account of his suspicions and his belief that Eleanor had murdered Christopher. But how to reveal it? I needed a moment that would force everyone, especially Daniel, to listen, to see, to understand the truth about the woman who had raised him. And then I remembered. Our 3rd anniversary was coming up in 2 months. Eleanor had been pushing for a big celebration, offering to host a dinner at her brownstone for family and close friends. She was planning to use the event to further drive a wedge between Daniel and me. I'd overheard her on the phone with Daniel, suggesting he make a toast about the challenges of marriage and the importance of family support, clearly positioning herself as the stable force in his life versus me, the problematic wife. Perfect. She was handing me the stage for her own downfall. I accepted her offer to host the anniversary dinner. I even acted grateful, thanked her profusely, let her believe she was winning. And then I sent out additional invitations to Margaret Chen, to Diane, to Patricia's old colleague, to several other people from Eleanor's past who had stories to tell. I told each of them to arrive at the dinner and to be prepared to speak truth. I also contacted a journalist friend who worked for a major newspaper. I explained the story, provided her with copies of all my evidence, and asked if she'd be interested in covering the exposure of Eleanor Matthews's decades of manipulation and possible crimes. She jumped at the opportunity. Everything was set, the stage was prepared, and Eleanor Matthews had no idea that her perfect anniversary dinner was about to be her public crucifixion. The night of our anniversary dinner arrived. Eleanor's brownstone was decorated beautifully, flowers everywhere, candles, elegant place settings for 30 guests. She had spared no expense, clearly wanting to showcase her role as the perfect, loving mother-in-law hosting a celebration for her son and his wife. If only she knew what was coming. Daniel and I arrived early. He was in a good mood, happy to celebrate our anniversary, completely unaware of the bomb I was about to detonate. I felt a moment of guilt. This was going to destroy his image of his mother, shatter his sense of family history, force him to confront horrible truths. But I reminded myself that living with Eleanor's poison was worse. Better a painful truth than a comfortable lie that was slowly killing us both. Guests began arriving. Eleanor worked the room like the society maven she was, greeting everyone with her perfect smile, playing the gracious hostess. She was particularly warm to me that night, clearly confident that she'd won, that my marriage was on the verge of collapse, that soon she'd have Daniel all to herself again. Then Margaret Chen arrived. Eleanor's smile froze when she saw her. "Margaret? I didn't realize you were... How did..." "Sarah invited me," Margaret said calmly. "We've become friends, Eleanor. She's a lovely young woman, much too good for you." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she recovered quickly. "How nice. Please, come in." One by one, the other witnesses I'd invited arrived. I watched Eleanor's growing alarm as she recognized faces from her past, people she'd destroyed, people she'd driven away, people who knew her secrets. But she was trapped. These were guests at a dinner party in her home. She couldn't throw them out without causing a scene. Finally, everyone was assembled. Eleanor called us all to dinner. We took our seats at the long mahogany table, Daniel and I at one end, Eleanor at the other, our guests filling the seats between us. Eleanor stood to make a toast. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate Daniel and Sarah's anniversary. 3 years of marriage, quite an accomplishment in this day and age." Her tone suggested it was surprising we'd lasted that long. "I want to toast my son, who has always been the light of my life, and who I hope will always remember that his mother loves him unconditionally and only wants what's best for him." The words were loving, but the subtext was clear. I'm his real family, I'm the one who matters, you're temporary. But not for much longer. Thank you, Eleanor, I said, standing up. I'd also like to say a few words, if I may. Eleanor sat down, looking pleased. She probably thought I was going to make some self-deprecating speech about being grateful for her guidance. 3 years ago, I married the love of my life. Daniel Matthews is the best man I've ever known. Kind, honest, good-hearted, talented. I couldn't believe my luck when he chose me. I paused, looking around the table. But this marriage hasn't been easy, not because of anything Daniel did, but because from day one, someone has been working tirelessly to destroy it. Eleanor's smile became strained. Sarah, dear, perhaps— I'm not finished, I said firmly. For 3 years, Eleanor Matthews has been poisoning my husband against me. Subtle comments about my appearance, my career, my worth, manipulation designed to make me feel inadequate and make Daniel doubt our marriage, all while playing the perfect mother-in-law in public. This is absurd, Eleanor said, standing up. Daniel, are you going to let her— Mom, let her finish, Daniel said quietly. I could see confusion in his eyes, but also something else, a flicker of recognition, as if pieces were finally clicking into place. But the manipulation of me is nothing compared to Eleanor's real crimes, so I'd like to introduce some guests. Margaret Chen, would you stand, please? Margaret stood. Eleanor's face went white. Margaret is Thomas Matthews's cousin. Thomas was Daniel's father. And Margaret, please tell everyone what Thomas told you about his first wife's death. Margaret spoke clearly. Thomas believed Eleanor murdered their 7-year-old son, Christopher. He never had proof, but he was convinced that Eleanor killed the 7-year-old boy because she couldn't control him. The room erupted. Daniel stood up so fast his chair fell backward. What? What are you talking about? I don't have a brother. You did, I said gently. Christopher Matthews. He died in 1985 before you were born. Your father tried to investigate, but Eleanor's family had too much power. He divorced her, remarried your mother, Patricia, and then Patricia died, and Eleanor moved back in.
That's a lie, Eleanor shrieked. Thomas died of a heart attack. Patricia died of cancer. These things happen. They do, I agreed. But they seem to happen a lot around you, Eleanor. Diane, would you stand? Diane stood and shared her story of how Eleanor destroyed her marriage. Then Patricia's colleague stood and shared Patricia's fears. One by one, witnesses stood and testified to Eleanor's pattern of destruction, manipulation, and control. Daniel's face was ashen. He was staring at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. This is all lies, Eleanor was screaming now. Lies and conspiracy theories. Daniel, don't listen to them. They're trying to turn you against me. And finally, I said, pulling out the journal, I have Thomas Matthews' personal journal, found in a box of his things that you stored in your attic, Eleanor. The box you gave to Daniel when we moved. You probably forgot it was there. Let me read you his final entry. I read Thomas's words aloud, his suspicions, his fears, his belief that Eleanor had murdered Christopher, his plan to confront her and make her leave, his words written 2 days before his sudden, convenient death. The room was completely silent when I finished. Everyone was staring at Eleanor. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Mom, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't— Eleanor's face had transformed. The mask of the perfect society matron was gone. What remained was something cold and empty and terrifying. You ungrateful little bitch, she hissed at me. I gave you everything. I welcomed you into this family, and this is how you repay me? You tried to destroy me, I said calmly. You've been trying from the beginning, because you can't stand for Daniel to love anyone but you. He's my son, mine. I raised him. I sacrificed for him. I shaped him into the man he is. And you think you can just waltz in and take him from me? Just like Patricia tried. Just like Christopher was starting to. The room went dead silent. Eleanor seemed to realize what she'd just admitted. Christopher was starting to, Daniel repeated. What does that mean, Mom? What does that mean? Eleanor's face crumpled. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She looked like what she was, a sick, broken woman who had destroyed everyone who tried to love her because she couldn't distinguish love from control. He wouldn't listen. Christopher wouldn't listen. He kept defying me, challenging me, wanting to do things his own way. He told Thomas he wanted to go live with his grandmother. He was going to leave me. I couldn't let that happen. Oh my God, Daniel breathed. You killed him. You killed your own son. I didn't mean to. Eleanor's voice rose to a shriek. The pills were just supposed to make him drowsy, compliant, but he fought me on the stairs, tried to run, and he fell. It was an accident, but he brought it on himself by defying me. The room exploded with shocked exclamations. Someone, I think it was Margaret, started crying. Daniel was backing away from his mother as if she were something toxic. And Dad? Did you kill him too? Eleanor's silence was answer enough. He was going to make me leave, she finally said. After everything I'd done for you, for him, he was going to throw me out. I couldn't let that happen. You needed me. You've always needed me. You need me? Daniel's voice was full of anguish and rage. You murdered my brother. You murdered my father. You've been controlling me my entire life, and you've spent 3 years trying to destroy the woman I love because she threatened your control. He turned to me, tears streaming down his face. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. I chose her over you again and again, and I'm so sorry. I went to him, held him while he sobbed. Around us, guests were on their phones, calling lawyers, calling the police, calling the press. The journalist I'd invited was recording everything, her eyes wide with shock at the magnitude of the story unfolding. Eleanor stood at the head of her elegant table in her perfect dining room, watching her world collapse, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw fear in her eyes. Daniel, she said, reaching out to him. Daniel, please, I did it all for you. Everything I've ever done has been for you. I love you. No, Daniel said, his voice breaking. You don't love me. You own me, or you think you do, but not anymore. Sarah, we're leaving. We walked out of that brownstone together, leaving Eleanor surrounded by the ruins of her perfect facade. Behind us, I could hear her screaming, crying, begging Daniel to come back, but he didn't look back. The police arrived as we were getting in our car. I'd already sent them copies of all my evidence. Eleanor Matthews was arrested that night on suspicion of the murder of Thomas Matthews. The statute of limitations hadn't run out, and between Thomas's journal and Eleanor's own confession in front of 30 witnesses, the DA felt confident they could build a case. The story hit the news the next morning. Society matron arrested for husband's murder, read the headline. The story of Christopher's death was reopened. Eleanor's decades of manipulation and control were exposed to the world.
That was 2 years ago. Eleanor Matthews is currently in prison, awaiting trial for murder. Her expensive lawyers have managed to delay proceedings, but the evidence is overwhelming. Thomas's journal, her confession in front of witnesses, the reopened investigation into Christopher's death. She'll never be free again. Daniel went through hell in the aftermath. He spent months in therapy, processing the truth about his mother, grieving for the brother he never knew and the father who had tried to protect him. He felt guilt for not believing me sooner, for allowing Eleanor to poison our marriage, for being blind to her manipulation. But we made it through. Our marriage is stronger now than it ever was. The crisis forced us to communicate honestly, to set healthy boundaries, to prioritize our relationship above all else. We learned to be partners in the truest sense of the word. We've also worked to honor Christopher's memory. With Margaret Chen's help, we established a foundation in his name that helps children escape abusive situations. Every year on what would have been Christopher's birthday, we volunteer with organizations that support children's mental health and safety. Daniel designed a memorial for Christopher in our garden, a beautiful sculpture of a child reaching toward the sky, symbolizing freedom and hope. Sometimes I find Daniel there, talking to the brother he never met, telling him about our life, promising that his death wasn't in vain. As for me, I've become an advocate for people dealing with toxic family members. I speak at conferences about recognizing psychological abuse, setting boundaries, and protecting yourself from manipulative people. I've shared our story, with Daniel's permission, because I believe others need to hear it, need to know that if someone is making you feel crazy, inadequate, or worthless, you're not imagining it, and you have the right to defend yourself. The most important lesson I learned is this: some people are simply incapable of healthy love. They see other people as extensions of themselves, as possessions to control rather than individuals to cherish. Eleanor loved Daniel the way a collector loves a rare object. She wanted to keep him pristine in her display case, unchanging and completely under her control. But real love means letting people grow, change, make their own choices. It means supporting them even when they choose paths you wouldn't choose. It means accepting that they might love others without loving you less. Eleanor couldn't do that, and it destroyed her. I sometimes wonder if things could have been different, if Eleanor had gotten help decades ago, if someone had stopped her before Christopher's death, if she'd been held accountable sooner. But I've learned I can't change the past. I can only work to ensure that her victims, the living ones, have a chance to heal. Daniel and I are trying for a baby now. When we have children, they'll never know their grandmother Eleanor, but they'll know about Christopher, about Thomas's love for his sons, about the importance of recognizing and escaping toxic relationships. They'll be raised with love that sets them free, rather than love that traps them. Last month, I got a letter from Eleanor. It was delivered through her lawyer. She's not allowed direct contact with us. In it, she insisted she still loved Daniel, that everything she did was for his own good, that someday he'd understand and forgive her. Daniel read it once and then shredded it. "She still doesn't get it," he said quietly. "She murdered her own son, destroyed my father, and nearly destroyed my marriage, and she still thinks she's the victim." He's right. Eleanor will probably die in prison, still believing she was justified, still unable to see the horror of what she'd done. Some people never change because they can't see that they're broken. But we've changed, we've healed, and we've built a life based on honest love, healthy boundaries, and mutual respect. Everything Eleanor's toxic love could never allow. So if you're watching this and recognize elements of your own story, if you have a family member who makes you feel worthless, who manipulates those around you, who can't let go of control, please know that you're not alone. You're not crazy. You deserve better. And you have the right to protect yourself, even if it means exposing uncomfortable truths. Because sometimes the only way to save yourself is to bring the darkness into the light.